Today, Secretary Kerry said this treaty will not diminish anyone's freedom. Here is yet but another promise. Do we really think it's credible? Last month, the Obama administration took executive action to ban the import of Korean War-era vintage collectible M1s Garand rifles on spurious public safety grounds. These are collector's items. This shows how this administration action can be used to choke off firearms imports. The United Nations Arms Trade Treaty will only encourage more mischief. It only holds the good accountable and lets the bad do what they want. In the real world, promises do matter. We have made strategic, moral, and legal commitments to provide arms to key allies, such as the Republic of China, Taiwan, and the State of Israel. What do these promises really mean to President Obama? And what message does the ATT send to our allies? And they wonder, is America really there for us when we need them? Or is this just more talk, more empty words? The American people have had enough of the Obama administration's broken promises and phony, non-existent red lines on the ATT. I urge my colleagues to join together to oppose the ATT. Now, at this time, Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield some time to my friend from Oregon, Mr. Greg Walden.
I thank the gentleman, my friend, and great defender of the United States Constitution, Mr. Kelly of Pennsylvania. This is a very troubling day for those of us who believe in our freedom in America and our rights under the Constitution, and every day defend America's sovereignty. You know, Oregon's 2nd Congressional District is nearly 70,000 square miles. That's a lot of ground. It's home to some of the best hunting in the West, including mule deer and elk and cougar, bighorn sheep and antelope, in addition to various waterfowl and upland birds. Oregonians' proud heritage of hunting and owning firearms for sport and protection and their livelihood dates back to the days of the Oregon Trail, a trail my ancestors crossed in 1845 when they helped settle the West. You know, as one hunter in Baker City, Oregon, told me earlier this year, he said, "Congressman, you know why they call this the 2nd District? It's because we believe in our Second Amendment rights." And he's right. Yet today, about 10 hours ago, Secretary of State John Kerry signed a very vague UN treaty that leaves open the door to international influences trampling on our Second Amendment rights to keep and bear arms. And it encourages signatory nations to collect identities of owners of imported firearms, setting the stage for a potential national gun registry, and that is wrong. The United States is a sovereign nation. I strongly believe that our Constitution, including our Second Amendment rights, must never be subrogated by a treaty. Now, what's worse, we understand the administration that signed this treaty may now never send it to the Senate for consideration. I view that as another blatant attempt by the Obama administration to act unilaterally. They seem to do a lot of that these days, without the consent or the approval of Congress. So I will strongly oppose not only this treaty, but also any funding to implement any policy related to this treaty. And I will continue to uphold the oath of office that each one of us in this chamber took to defend our rights and freedoms as enshrined in that great document, the Constitution, and to make sure that our Constitution and our sovereign rights are always above any foreign treaty, including one that never even gets sent to the Senate. I yield back to my colleague from Pennsylvania.
I thank the gentleman, and I now recognize Mr. Lambert from Colorado.
Thank you, Congressman Kelly, for hosting this important hour to share with the American people the serious problems with the UN Arms Trade Treaty. Mr. Speaker, as co-chairman of the House Sovereignty Caucus, I assure you this ambiguous treaty poses serious threats to American national security, foreign policy, and economic interests, as well as our constitutional rights. U.S. arms exports are among the safest in the world. The United States should reject the UN's attempt to force us into a system that could jeopardize the safety of our citizens or those of our allies. This treaty includes small arms and light weapons within its scope, which covers firearms owned by law-abiding Americans. It sets up a broad registration scheme that threatens the individual's firearms rights. The Arms Trade Treaty also threatens the ability of the U.S. to protect our allies around the world, since it contains questionable language that could be misused to prevent America from arming allies such as Israel or Taiwan. President Obama knows that even members of his own party won't support this treaty in many cases. He must think that gun control must be pursued no matter what. In my own state of Colorado, voters just recalled 2 state senators who pushed gun control against the wishes of their voters. These were historic elections because no Colorado legislator had ever been recalled in the history of the state. I urge the members of the Senate to reject this treaty and protect our Second Amendment rights and our national sovereignty. Thank you, and I yield back to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Collected their records. And now we have a treaty, so-called treaty, with stamps on our individual rights, undermines our Constitution, and strips us of any kind of protection. They said, don't worry about it. The Senate will never ratify it. But in a tradition of treaties, once a treaty is signed, our nation typically follows that treaty. Yet we're seeing before us a president who's not listening to the people. Time and time again, these actions are taken when there's, like a magician, he's over here, focusing over here, and he did this in a day in which a Texas senator was speaking. This is all designed for us to be asleep while our rights are being stripped. When is the American people going to wake up and realize that the book 1984 has come about? Your rights are being stripped and I hear nothing. My friend Bill Murray, who is an unwilling participant in a lawsuit to take prayer out of schools, said it best. His mother was an atheist who sued. And he said the greatest fear that she had was that the American people would rise up. But what happened was nothing. Not a word was said. And today, your rights were stripped. And we hear silence. It reminds me when Jesus was praying and he turned to his disciples and they fell asleep, there was silence. Go on, sleep. America, go on, sleep. Your rights are being stripped and you say nothing. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Texas. At this time, I'd like to recognize Jim Bridenstine, who represents Oklahoma 51.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd also like to thank my colleague, Congressman Kelly from Pennsylvania, for yielding me the time. I'd also like to thank my good friend, the senior senator from Oklahoma, Jim Inhofe, who has been the upper chamber's fiercest opponent of the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty. I'm proud that Senator Inhofe also stands firmly with Senator Cruz in his fight to defund Obamacare. There seems to be some confusion about that back in Oklahoma, but he has been standing with Senator Cruz from the beginning. Mr. Speaker, already this year, the president tried to ban guns he thinks look scary. They don't operate any differently. They just look scary, so he tried to ban them. Rejected by Congress, the president tried to create what is effectively a national gun registry. The American people and their representatives rejected that plan as well. In response, President Obama today had his Secretary of State sign what is effectively an international gun control treaty that will ultimately force all of us to register our guns and our names and our information into an international database. President Obama once again demonstrated his hostility to the Constitution, to the Second Amendment, and to the U.S. sovereignty by signing the UN Arms Trade Treaty. This president is fundamentally antagonistic toward both our constitutional right to keep and bear arms and American independence from international bodies. Why is the UN Arms Trade Treaty so dangerous? First, the treaty is ambiguously worded. Its basic terms are not even defined, which permits gun-grabbing UN bureaucrats the widest possible interpretive scope. We all know that the UN gun grabbers will interpret this treaty just as loosely as the president interprets the Constitution of the United States. Second, the Arms Trade Treaty is a direct shot at the Second Amendment of the Constitution. Lawful ownership and use of firearms, including for self-defense, are basic constitutional rights. The treaty does not recognize this. In fact, the Arms Trade Treaty, quote, encourages governments to collect the identities of individual end users of imported firearms at the national level, unquote. This is the core of a national gun registry. The treaty also creates a national, quote, responsibility to prevent the, quote, diversion of firearms for illegal trade. Since illicit trade is not defined, does this mean one American selling a gun to another American counts as illegal? Who's to say? Groups like Amnesty International have already stated that the Arms Trade Treaty is a start down the path of control for domestic internal gun sales. This is international gun control, plain and simple. Mr. Speaker, the Arms Trade Treaty is fully consistent with the President's policy of ceding more U.S. sovereignty to international bodies. He's pushed the Senate to ratify treaties that do nothing except diminish U.S. sovereignty. These treaties include the UN Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the rights of children, and the elimination of discrimination against women. Does this mean that the United States finds no morally compelling interest in protecting disabled persons, children, or women? Of course not. In each of these cases, U.S. domestic law imposes far higher standards of protection than many of the countries that have ratified all three of these treaties. For example, such beacons of human freedom as Cuba and China, Nigeria, Russia, and Syria have ratified all three of these treaties. North Korea and Iran have ratified 2 of the 3. Unlike these countries, though, the United States actually upholds its treaty obligations. Mr. Speaker, the Arms Trade Treaty is a perfect example of a dangerous trend in international legal thinking called transnationalism. The goal of transnationalists is to, quote, circumvent resistant legislatures and, quote, download so-called global norms. We've heard the President talk about global norms ad nauseum. But the idea is to circumvent resistant legislatures and download global norms into U.S. and other domestic law. Let me say that again. The transnationalists pushing the Arms Trade Treaty, like Amnesty International, want to avoid Congress. They want to avoid us, the people's representatives, and impose international law from foreign bodies. Mr. Speaker, perhaps the pro-Arms Trade Treaty supporters need a lesson in the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. We choose those that govern us and under which laws we live. We should not give up our God-given rights and liberties to foreign bodies such as the United Nations. The Second Amendment is not up for debate. The individual right of Americans to keep and bear arms is not a matter of discussion for foreigners. The President will treat the Arms Trade Treaty as binding on America, no matter what the Senate does. He can't impose gun control in Congress, so he's going to use an international treaty instead. I pray that the Senate rips this treaty to pieces and that our next president removes America's signature and with it, this hideous assault on our Constitution. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Feinstein. At this time, I'd like to recognize the member from Mississippi 1, Mr. Alan Nunley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my friend from Pennsylvania for yielding, but also for his leadership on this important issue. I rise in strong opposition to the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty. The Obama administration has a disturbing tendency to favor international regulation over American sovereignty. And this Arms Trade Treaty is just the latest example. The government of the United States was created by we the people. And we the people established the Constitution in order to limit that government. But as a condition of establishing that Constitution, we the people insisted that a Bill of Rights be adopted, a Bill of Rights that would guarantee every citizen of our nation rights. An important plank in that Bill of Rights includes the right to keep and bear arms, and it's guaranteed by our Constitution. Under no circumstances should we ever agree to a treaty that undermines on that right. This arms trade treaty encourages nations to collect the identities of owners of imported firearms, which constitutes the core of a national gun registry. The treaty also requires nations to report the data they collect to the United Nations. If that data contains information on individual gun owners, it would be a serious violation of privacy. The treaty could also restrict the ability of the United States to conduct foreign policy and to sell arms to our allies such as Israel. Now, we've seen in recent months what happens when we rely on the international community to act on America's interest. Russia, China, and the rest of the United Nations should never be given veto authority over American foreign policy, and we should never, ever subject the United States Constitution to the whims of the United Nations. The Second Amendment is sacred. We should always stand up and protect it. And that's why I strongly oppose the United Nations Arms Treaty and urge the United States Senate to reject it forthrightly. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Mississippi. You know, Mr. Speaker, we've heard from a number of members tonight, and I think this is a day that we really have to reflect back and look at mixed messages. Back in 2009 at a NATO summit in Strasbourg, France, the president said, "I believe in American exceptionalism, just as I suspect that the Brits believe in British exceptionalism and the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism." Yesterday, the president stood in front of the United Nations and said, "Some may disagree, but I believe America is exceptional, in part because we have shown a willingness through the sacrifice of blood and treasure to stand up not only for our own narrow self-interest, but for the interest of all." I would just like to suggest to the president that integrity is defined by saying what you mean and meaning what you say. Taking a moment to express something that may or may not be the true core value of who you are, what you believe, is not acceptable. What makes us truly exceptional as Americans is we are there every day in every way to those who we told we would be. Now, the U.S. has the most sophisticated arms export control system in the world. It has commonly been called the gold standard. And that term, gold standard, was used by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Yet this arms trade treaty does nothing at all to improve our system. We not only have laws on the export of arms, we actually enforce them. People can and regularly do go to jail for breaking those laws. Now, the arms trade treaty will not improve the systems in other countries, which in many cases actually have no system at all. There's a lot more to running an effective arms export control system than simply signing a piece of paper.